Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is February 27th. On this day in 2005, 9-year-old Jessica Lunsford, a bright and loving child, was murdered after she was abducted from her bedroom in Homosassa, Florida, and held captive for days by a local predator. In today's episode, we'll talk about Jessica's life, the harrowing details of her disappearance, the investigation that followed, and the confession that led to justice. Plus, we'll discuss the lasting impact of her case. Let's get started. Jessica Marie Lunsford was born on October 6, 1995 in Gastonia, North Carolina. She's been described as a happy, affectionate child who loved animals, music, and playing outside with her friends. After her parents' divorce, Jessica primarily lived with her father, Mark, a truck driver, and her grandparents in Homosassa, Florida. Jessica loved singing in her church choir and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. Her father often spoke about how much she loved the color purple, dolphins, and spending time with her family. By all accounts, she was a well-loved and happy child. But on the night of February 23rd, 2005, everything changed. That night, Jessica went to bed as usual in her family's home. But the next morning, when Mark went to wake her for school, she was gone. Mark later said, quote, "It was like she vanished into thin air. Everything was in its place, except Jessica." And that's really true. There was no sign of forced entry, there were no broken windows, and there was no indication of a struggle within her room. Her shoes and clothes were untouched, indicating that she hadn't left by herself. She must have been somehow taken during the night. Mark immediately called the Citrus County Sheriff's Office, and within hours, a massive search was underway. The small community of Homosassa quickly came together to support the Lunsford family. Hundreds of volunteers joined local law enforcement in searching wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and nearby waterways. Flyers with Jessica's face were distributed across the county, and media coverage spread nationwide. Sheriff Jeff Dawsey reassured the public, quote, "We will not stop until we find this little girl. This is our highest priority," end quote. Now, just as a side note, my dad and stepmom have lived in Homosassa, Florida for years, and it truly is a very small town, but searching it must have been an absolute nightmare. It sits on the Homosassa River, which is huge, and leads out to the Gulf of Mexico. There are also a lot of swampy areas and thick brush that I can only imagine was incredibly difficult to wade through. While the searches were taking place, authorities also questioned family members, neighbors, and anyone who had recent contact with Jessica. One of those questioned was 46-year-old John Evander Couey, a convicted sex offender who lived just 150 yards away in a trailer owned by his half-sister, Dorothy Dixon. Couey had an extensive criminal history, including burglary, drug-related offenses, and inappropriate contact with minors. Now, what's interesting about this is that Couey was interviewed not because he was a sex offender, but because he lived so close. He actually hadn't registered as a sex offender once he moved into that trailer, so he wasn't on the registry where he was supposed to be. When he was initially interviewed, Couey denied any involvement in Jessica's disappearance. He was cooperative, but he was also visibly nervous. Now, the problem is that investigators didn't know if that was because he had done something to Jessica or because he had been caught not giving his current address. His half-sister Dorothy also told investigators that John had been home the night that Jessica disappeared. So while he may have looked very suspicious to investigators, without any direct evidence linking him to the case, they had no grounds to hold him at that time. As weeks passed with no sign of Jessica, Mark Lunsford appeared on television pleading for help. He said, quote, "Jessica, if you can hear me, we love you and we're looking for you. Hold on, baby, we're going to find you," end quote. But what investigators didn't know is that Jessica was much closer than anyone realized. For the first 3 days she was missing, she was hidden in a closet in Couey's trailer. As the weeks went on, police started to take a harder look at Couey. And 3 weeks after Jessica's disappearance, he fled to Augusta, Georgia. And it was there that he was arrested on an unrelated probation violation. While in custody, investigators questioned him about Jessica's disappearance yet again. This time, they had had enough evidence that they had been able to search his trailer. So under pressure and when confronted with forensic evidence that police had found in that search, Couey broke down. He admitted, quote, "I took her. I didn't mean for it to happen this way," end quote. In a chilling confession, Couey described how he had entered the Lunsford home in the early hours of February 24th through an unlocked door. He found Jessica asleep, carried her back to his trailer, and kept her there for 3 days. Jessica begged to be returned to her family. Couey said, quote, "She kept asking for her daddy. I didn't know what to do," end quote. On the 3rd day, fearing that law enforcement was closing in, Couey panicked. He placed Jessica in garbage bags, leaving small holes near her nose and mouth. He then dug a shallow grave behind the trailer and buried her alive. When investigators excavated the site, they found Jessica's body wrapped in plastic. Her hands were poking through the garbage bag, indicating that she had tried to escape. Citrus County Medical Examiner Dr. Stephen Cogswell later confirmed, quote, "She fought until the very end," end quote. With overwhelming evidence against him, Couey was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery. The trial was moved to Miami due to extensive media coverage. During opening arguments, Assistant State Attorney Rick Ridgway told the jury, quote, "This case is about the ultimate betrayal of innocence. A child taken from her home, subjected to unimaginable terror, and buried alive just steps from where she should have been safe," end quote. The prosecution presented DNA evidence linking Jessica to Couey's trailer, his confession, and testimony from investigators. Excerpts of Couey's taped confession were also played in court. The defense argued that there were mitigating factors and cited Couey's low IQ and troubled background, but the jury found him guilty on all counts. On August 24th, 2007, Judge Richard Howard sentenced Couey to death, saying, quote, "The defendant's actions were not only criminal, but monstrously cruel. This court finds no mitigating circumstances that outweigh the brutality of this crime." However, Couey would never actually face the death penalty. He died of natural causes 2 years later in 2009 while awaiting execution. Jessica's murder led to swift legislative action. In 2005, Florida passed Jessica's Law, imposing harsher penalties on sex offenders, including mandatory 25-year minimum sentences and lifetime GPS monitoring. The law quickly spread around the U.S., with more than 40 states enacting their version of it. Jessica's father, Mark Lunsford, became a tireless advocate for child safety. He established the Jessica Marie Lunsford Foundation and worked with lawmakers to improve protections for children, stating, quote, "Jessica's legacy is not just about what happened to her. It's about making sure no other child suffers the same fate," end quote. Despite some controversy over the mandatory minimums, supporters argue that Jessica's Law has prevented countless crimes. Jessica Lunsford's story is one of unimaginable tragedy, but her death led to reforms that continue to protect children today. While nothing can undo the horror of what happened to her, her legacy lives on in the laws that bear her name and the children who are safer because of them. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!